one of the arguments made against Allah or God in Islam is that God deceives or God schemes against people. And the people who argue this would be Christians like David Wood, Sam Shamoun, etc., saying that God in Islam, Allah, schemes or plots against people. The problem with them saying that is the problem arises because they're not really reading the Quran in its proper context. If you read the Quran in context, you know who God is scheming against. God is scheming or God is planning not against, innocent people, but disbelievers and enemies of Allah or God. We read this in the Quran, chapter 3, verse 54, where it says, the enemies of Jesus, they plotted and God is the best of plotters. Quran chapter 3, verse 54. Further, we read that when God schemes or when God plots against, God is plotting against the schemes of the disbelieving people in the Quran chapter 8, verse 30, Quran chapter 13, verse 42, and the Quran chapter 27, verse 50. So some understand, so God scheming or Allah scheming means to, when Allah schemes or when Allah plots against people, he's plotting against, people who are disbelieving people or people who are enemies of believers or enemies of God. So Allah or God is not scheming against normal people or regular people. He's scheming or he's plotting against people who are disbelievers and people who are enemies of God and God's prophets, etc. For example, in the Quran chapter 3, verse 54, Allah schemes or plots against the enemies of Jesus. In the Quran chapter 8, verse 30, and in the Quran chapter 8, verse 30, Allah or God schemes against the Quraysh, who are the enemies of who are enemies of the Prophet Muhammad and the early Muslims who are trying to kill the Prophet Muhammad and the early Muslims. So in Islamic theology, God or Allah schemes against disbelieving people who are also mischief makers, who are also enemies of believers and prophets, and basically God plots against or schemes against disbelieving people who are also evil or who do evil acts, as we see in the Quran chapter 3, verse 54, where God plotted against the enemies of Jesus. So these enemies of Jesus were mischief makers, they were disbelievers, they were trying to cause harm to Jesus, so that's why God plotted against them. Same thing with the Quran, chapter 8, verse 30. The Quraysh were plotting against the Prophet Muhammad, they were plotting against the Muslims, they wanted to kill the Muslims, and God planned and plotted against them. So that's the whole concept of God scheming, God's or Allah's scheme in Quranic theology. He's scheming or he's plotting against disbelieving people who are enemies of God and want to do mischief or corruption. So these are evil people God plots against and God schemes against. So God is not plotting against innocent people or innocent disbelievers. No, he's plotting against evil people, evil disbelievers, enemies of prophets, enemies of believers, etc., etc. So that's the whole concept. Stay tuned. The final videos are coming up ahead.